Most people don't fail because they lack talent. In fact, many of the most talented people you know are still stuck exactly where they were years ago. They don't fail because they lack opportunity either. We live in a time where information, access, and tools are everywhere. Opportunities are no longer hidden behind locked doors. They're in our pockets, on our screens, and available 24 hours a day. And yet, despite all of this, progress feels rare. Momentum feels fragile. Real change feels slow. People fail because there is a gap, a quiet, invisible gap between what they know they should do and what they actually do every single day. Everyone knows what consistency looks like. Wake up early, do the work, practice the skill, show up even when it's uncomfortable. Everyone knows this. Knowledge has never been the problem. The problem is execution. The problem is repetition. The problem is doing the boring, unglamorous work when no one is watching and no one is applauding. We live in a world overflowing with motivation. It's everywhere. Books that promise transformation in 30 days. Videos that light a fire for 10 minutes. Quotes that sound powerful but fade by lunchtime. Podcasts that make you feel like you're moving forward while you're sitting completely still. We consume inspiration like entertainment, and for a moment it feels good. For a moment, we feel capable. For a moment, we feel ready, and then life shows up. The alarm rings earlier than expected. The day gets busy, energy drops, doubt creeps in, discomfort feels louder than desire, and suddenly motivation disappears. Not because you stopped caring, but because motivation was never designed to carry you through repetition. Motivation is emotional. It rises and falls. It depends on mood, environment, and circumstance. And that's why consistency remains rare. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Consistency is not a personality trait. Some people aren't born consistent and others inconsistent. That story is comforting, but it's false. Consistency is not discipline either. Discipline implies force, pressure, and constant resistance. And it's not willpower. Willpower is limited. It gets exhausted. It fades under stress. Consistency is a system. And systems don't depend on how you feel. Systems operate regardless of emotion. Systems work when motivation is high and when motivation is completely gone. That's why the people who appear disciplined from the outside often aren't fighting themselves at all. They've simply removed friction. They've designed their lives in a way where the right actions are easier than the wrong ones. In 2026, the people who win won't be the most motivated. They won't be the loudest, the most confident, or the most intense. They'll be the ones who understand how to force consistency, even on days they don't feel like it. Especially on days they don't feel like it. Because those days are the ones that matter most. Consistency isn't about heroic effort. It's about reliability. It's about showing up when the outcome feels uncertain. It's about doing small things repeatedly long before the results become visible. And that's why most people quit. Not because the goal isn't important, but because the distance between effort and reward feels too long. That gap between knowing and doing slowly erodes confidence. Every skipped day becomes a quiet vote against yourself. Every broken promise weakens trust in your own word. Over time, people don't just stop believing in the process, they stop believing in themselves. And once that happens, even simple actions feel heavy. But the opposite is also true. When consistency becomes non-negotiable, something powerful happens beneath the surface. You stop relying on emotion. You stop negotiating with resistance. You stop asking yourself whether you feel like doing the work. You simply do it because the system says so. And when that happens, momentum begins to build quietly. Most people are chasing intensity. They want breakthroughs. They want dramatic change. They want results that prove they're moving forward. But real transformation doesn't come from intensity. It comes from stability, from actions so small and repeatable that they don't require courage, only commitment. The irony is that people often wait to feel ready before they act. But readiness doesn't create consistency. Consistency creates readiness. Confidence doesn't come before action. It comes after repetition. The people who look confident today earn that confidence by showing up imperfectly for a long time. In 2026, the gap between average and exceptional won't be talent. It won't be intelligence. It won't even be opportunity. It will be consistency. The ability to execute when no one is forcing you. The ability to stay when quitting would be easier. The ability to keep promises to yourself when breaking them would go unnoticed. If you stay until the end of this talk, you won't just feel inspired. Inspiration is temporary. What you'll gain instead is clarity. You'll walk away with 3 practical ways to make consistency automatic, unavoidable, and identity-driven, not dependent on mood, not dependent on motivation, but built into how you live, think, and decide. Because once consistency becomes non-negotiable, everything else finally starts to work. Goals stop feeling distant. Progress stops feeling accidental. Growth stops being something you hope for and starts becoming something you expect. Not because life gets easier, but because you become more reliable. And when you close the gap between knowing and doing, you don't just change your results. You change your relationship with yourself. Motivation is emotional. It rises when things feel exciting and disappears the moment things feel difficult. Consistency, on the other hand, is structural. It exists independently of emotion. It doesn't care whether you're inspired or exhausted, confident or uncertain. Motivation depends entirely on how you feel in the moment. Consistency depends on how your life is designed around the action you want to repeat. This distinction is where most people get stuck because we've been taught to chase motivation as if it's the engine of success. We wait to feel ready. We wait to feel inspired. We wait for the perfect emotional state before we act. And when that emotional state doesn't arrive, we assume something is wrong with us. We assume we're lazy, undisciplined, or not serious enough. But the problem was never a lack of desire. The problem was relying on something unstable to do the job of something permanent. Motivation is reactive. It responds to environment, sleep, stress, praise, rejection, and comparison. One good conversation can make you feel unstoppable. One bad day can make you question everything. That's not weakness, that's human nature. Expecting motivation to stay constant is like expecting the weather to stay sunny forever. It was never designed to work that way. Consistency, however, is proactive. It doesn't wait for the right feeling. It creates conditions where action happens by default. When consistency is present, you don't wake up asking whether you feel like doing the work. The decision has already been made. The path has already been cleared. The system quietly pulls you forward, even when your emotions try to pull you back. When motivation fades, most people quit. Not because they don't care, because nothing is forcing them to continue. There's no structure holding the behavior in place. There's no friction preventing them from stopping. Quitting feels painless. Skipping one day feels harmless. And because there's no immediate consequence, stopping becomes easy. This is why people start strong and disappear quietly. They don't make a dramatic decision to give up. They simply stop showing up. One missed day turns into two turns into a week. And eventually, the identity they were building fades into a memory. Not because they lacked ambition, but because ambition without structure collapses under pressure. We've been sold a dangerous idea. If it matters enough, you'll stay consistent. It sounds logical, it sounds motivating, it feels empowering, but it's not true. In fact, it's one of the most damaging beliefs we carry. Because when consistency breaks, we don't question the system. We question ourselves. We assume it didn't matter enough. We assume we weren't serious enough. And that assumption erodes self-trust. The truth is the opposite. If you design for consistency, it will start to matter more. Commitment doesn't come first, it follows action. Caring deeply about something doesn't guarantee consistency, but consistent action guarantees deeper commitment. The more you show up, the more invested you become. The more invested you become, the harder it feels to walk away. People don't fall in love with goals, they fall in love with progress. And progress is created by structure, not emotion. Think about the habits that already exist in your life. You don't rely on motivation to brush your teeth. You don't need inspiration to check your phone. You don't debate whether to do them. They happen because the environment supports them. They're easy to start and slightly uncomfortable to skip. That's not discipline. That's design. Now think about the habits you struggle to maintain, the ones you keep restarting, the ones you promise yourself you'll be consistent with this time. Those habits usually require high emotional effort and constant decision making. They live in chaotic environments. They compete with distractions, and they have no system protecting them. When life gets busy, motivation is the first thing to go. Stress compresses your mental space. Fatigue lowers your tolerance for discomfort. And in those moments, the brain defaults to what's easiest, not what's important. That's why relying on motivation during hard seasons is a losing strategy. Consistency doesn't eliminate difficulty. It removes negotiation. It removes the internal debate that drains energy before you even begin. When action is automatic, resistance loses power. The work may still be hard, but starting becomes simple. This is why willpower is overrated. Willpower asks you to fight yourself every day. Systems ask you to cooperate with yourself. Willpower demands strength. Systems provide support. One burns out quickly, the other compounds quietly. People often admire consistency from the outside and assume those individuals are mentally tougher. But what they're really seeing is a life built with fewer decision points, fewer opportunities to quit, fewer chances to talk themselves out of showing up. The consistency looks impressive, but it's mostly invisible engineering. When motivation is high, almost anyone can start. The real question is what happens when motivation disappears. Do you have something in place that carries you forward? Or does everything collapse the moment emotion fades? Design answers that question. Design determines whether action feels optional or inevitable. It determines whether skipping feels neutral or uncomfortable. It determines whether progress continues quietly in the background or stops the moment attention shifts elsewhere. If you want to understand why motivation always fails, it's because we ask it to do a job it was never meant to do. Motivation is meant to start movement, not sustain it. It's meant to spark interest, not carry responsibility. Consistency sustained over time requires something sturdier than emotion. When you stop chasing motivation and start designing for consistency, something changes internally. You stop feeling guilty for not feeling inspired. You stop blaming yourself for human fluctuations. You begin focusing on what you can control: structure, environment, timing, and commitment. And as consistency takes root, motivation often returns, not as a requirement, but as a byproduct. Progress fuels belief, repetition builds confidence, and suddenly, the very thing you struggled to care about deeply starts to matter more than ever before. Because when action becomes reliable, belief follows. The first way to force consistency in 2026 is simple, but simple does not mean easy. It means clear, it means precise, it means removing complexity where it doesn't belong. Stop deciding every day, because every decision, no matter how small it seems, drains energy. Every choice creates friction. And friction, when repeated daily, becomes the silent killer of consistency. Most people think the problem is lack of discipline. It isn't. The problem is too many decisions. From the moment you wake up, you're already negotiating with yourself. What time should I start? Should I do it now or later? Should I do more or less today? Each question steals a little focus, a little clarity, a little momentum. By the time you actually begin, if you begin at all, you're already tired. The consistent people don't wake up asking, should I do it today? That question never enters their mind. They've already answered it once and for all. They decided in advance when emotion was calm and intention was clear. And once that decision was made, it was removed from daily debate. What used to feel like effort becomes routine. What used to require motivation becomes automatic. When you decide every day, you give your emotions a vote. And emotions are unreliable voters. They change based on sleep, stress, distraction, and doubt. But when the decision is already made, emotions lose their authority. You don't need to feel ready. You don't need to feel confident. You simply follow the plan. This is why routines are powerful. Not because they're rigid, but because they're freeing. A routine removes the burden of choice. It replaces uncertainty with structure. And structure creates momentum. When you know exactly what happens next, resistance is nowhere to hide. Consistency thrives on predictability. Same time, same place, same trigger. These are not restrictions, they are anchors. A specific time eliminates delay. A specific place removes distraction. A specific trigger turns action into a reflex. When these three align, the behavior stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like part of the day. Think about how many things you already do this way without effort. You don't debate whether to check your phone after waking up. The trigger happens and the action follows. You don't negotiate whether to eat at certain times. Your environment cues the behavior. That's not self-control, that's design. But when it comes to the habits that matter most, people leave everything open-ended. I'll do it sometime today. I'll fit it in when I can. I'll see how I feel. Open-ended plans invite excuses. They create loopholes. And loopholes are where consistency goes to die. When consistency becomes routine, effort disappears. Not because the work becomes easy, but because starting becomes effortless. The hardest part of any habit is the transition from not doing it to doing it. Routines eliminate that transition. There is no gap to cross. You simply arrive and begin. Self-control is a limited resource. The more you rely on it, the faster it depletes. That's why people are disciplined in the morning and exhausted by evening. But routines don't require self-control. They require obedience to a structure you already chose. If you want results in 2026, don't rely on self-control. Eliminate choice. Eliminating choice doesn't mean eliminating freedom. It means choosing freedom in advance. It means deciding what matters so you don't have to keep proving it to yourself. It means protecting your energy for execution instead of wasting it on indecision. Most people think freedom means keeping options open, but open options create mental noise. Real freedom comes from clarity, from knowing what you do when you do it and why it matters. When the path is clear, the mind relaxes. When the mind relaxes, action flows. The brain loves efficiency. It seeks the shortest path to comfort. When a habit requires constant decision making, the brain resists it. When a habit is automatic, the brain supports it. That's why removing the daily decision works. You're not fighting your nature, you're working with it. Consistency doesn't demand perfection, it demands reliability. And reliability is built through repetition, not effort. The more often you repeat a behavior in the same context, the stronger the association becomes. Eventually, the behavior feels incomplete if you skip it. That's when consistency becomes self-reinforcing. People often wait for the perfect routine before starting. But perfection is just another decision in disguise. The goal isn't to design the best system. The goal is to design one that removes daily debate. Simple beats optimal, repeatable beats impressive. Once the routine exists, identity begins to shift. You stop thinking of yourself as someone who is trying. You become someone who does. Not because you're forcing it, but because the structure supports it. Action changes identity faster than intention ever could. When the decision is eliminated, excuses lose their power. There's no space to argue, no room to postpone, no opportunity to bargain. The system doesn't care how you feel. It only cares that you show up. And that's the point. Consistency isn't about pushing harder. It's about deciding once and obeying daily. We don't act consistently for goals. Goals are external. They live in the future. They feel distant, abstract, and negotiable. We act consistently for identity. Identity is personal. It lives in the present. It shapes how we see ourselves and how we believe we should behave. When an action aligns with identity, it feels natural. When it conflicts with identity, it feels wrong. That's why identity is more powerful than motivation and stronger than discipline. You don't skip what defines you. You don't wake up debating whether to be who you are. A professional shows up because that's what a professional does. A leader speaks up because that's what leaders do. A person who respects themselves keeps promises to themselves because breaking them would violate who they believe they are. Identity removes debate. It replaces effort with alignment. This is why saying, "I'm trying to be consistent," never works. Trying keeps the behavior optional. It leaves the door open for excuses. It implies uncertainty. But when you say, "This is who I am," the behavior stops being something you attempt and starts being something you protect. Identity changes the emotional cost of inconsistency. Skipping no longer feels neutral. It feels like a betrayal of self. Consistency accelerates when your actions protect your identity. Not when they chase outcomes, not when they chase validation, but when they defend a self-image you refuse to compromise. People will sacrifice comfort to protect who they believe they are. They will endure difficulty to remain in alignment with their identity. They will tolerate discomfort, boredom, and resistance if quitting threatens their sense of self. Think about how powerful labels are. The moment you label yourself, behavior follows. If you see yourself as someone who shows up, absence feels wrong. If you see yourself as someone who finishes, quitting feels unnatural. If you see yourself as someone who keeps promises to themselves, breaking one feels heavier than the effort required to keep it. Identity pressure works silently but relentlessly. Most people build their identity on outcomes they haven't achieved yet. I'll believe I'm disciplined once I see results. Or I'll feel confident once I succeed. But identity doesn't follow results. Results follow identity. The identity must come first, even when there's no evidence yet. That's uncomfortable because it requires acting without external proof. But that's how consistency is born. Identity is shaped through language. The words you use to describe yourself become instructions for your behavior. When you say, "I'm bad at staying consistent," you're not stating a fact, you're reinforcing a rule. The brain obeys identity faster than it obeys logic. It will look for evidence to confirm whatever story you tell about yourself. This is why identity must be chosen deliberately, not inherited from past failures, not borrowed from other people's opinions, chosen. You decide who you are before the world decides for you. And once that identity is chosen, your actions either support it or challenge it. Most people unconsciously choose identities that excuse inconsistency. Few consciously choose identities that demand it. Identity pressure doesn't shout. It whispers. It shows up in moments of temptation, in moments when no one is watching, in moments where skipping would be easy and invisible. Identity is what speaks up then. It asks a simple question: is this who you are? When identity is clear, consistency becomes self-enforcing. You no longer need external accountability to stay on track. You don't need constant reminders or bursts of motivation. The cost of inconsistency is internal, and internal costs are far more powerful than external ones. This is why consistency tied to identity lasts longer than consistency tied to goals. Goals end, identities continue. Once a goal is achieved, behavior often stops. But when an identity is formed, behavior sustains itself. The action becomes part of who you are, not something due temporarily. Identity pressure also changes how you respond to failure. When identity is weak, one missed day becomes a reason to quit. When identity is strong, one missed day becomes a reason to return. Failure doesn't define you, quitting does. And quitting is incompatible with the identity you've chosen. The most consistent people aren't obsessed with perfection. They're committed to alignment. They don't panic when they fall short. They correct quickly because staying consistent is less about flawless execution and more about protecting who they are. This is why habits stick faster when they're framed as identity statements rather than tasks. I am the kind of person who shows up. I am the kind of person who finishes. I am the kind of person who keeps promises to myself. These aren't affirmations, they're standards. They set expectations for behavior, and behavior naturally rises to meet expectation. Identity pressure doesn't require force. It requires clarity. The clearer you are about who you are, the less effort consistency demands. Confusion creates hesitation. Clarity creates momentum. When you know who you are, the next action becomes obvious. In 2026, the question won't be what you're doing. Activities change. Goals evolve, circumstances shift. The real question will be who you believe you are when no one is watching, when motivation is gone, and when consistency is tested. Because behavior always follows belief. The fastest way to force consistency is to attach consequences. Human behavior responds far more strongly to loss than to gain. We can talk about discipline, desire, and long-term vision all day, but when there is no immediate cost for quitting, quitting becomes easy. It becomes rational. It becomes invisible. And when stopping carries no penalty, consistency never has a chance to take root. If nothing happens when you quit, quitting feels harmless. No one calls you out. No one confronts you. Nothing breaks. Life continues as usual. And because there's no external signal that something was lost, the brain registers quitting as safe. Over time, this trains you to walk away the moment discomfort appears. Not because you don't care, but because your environment is teaching you that stopping has no consequence. Consistency grows when quitting becomes uncomfortable. Not dramatic, not humiliating, but uncomfortable enough to pause before you walk away. Uncomfortable enough to create friction. Friction is what slows quitting down. And slowing quitting down is often all consistency needs to survive. People misunderstand consequences. They think consequences are punishment. They're not. Consequences are feedback. They tell the brain that an action matters. Without feedback, behavior doesn't change. With clear feedback, behavior adapts quickly. This is why habits supported by consequences last longer than habits supported by motivation. Public accountability works because it introduces social cost. When others know what you committed to, your actions no longer exist in isolation. Your identity becomes visible. Failing privately is easy. Failing publicly creates discomfort, not because of shame, but because humans are wired to protect their reputation. When reputation is involved, consistency becomes personal. Financial stakes work because money represents effort, time, and security. Losing money hurts more than gaining the same amount feels good. When there's money on the line, skipping stops being a casual decision. It becomes a calculation. Is avoiding discomfort worth the loss? Often it isn't. And that moment of hesitation is where consistency survives. Social commitments work because they create obligation. When others rely on you, quitting doesn't just affect you. It affects the group. It affects trust. And most people are far more willing to disappoint themselves than disappoint others. Social structures harness that reality. Instead of pretending it doesn't exist, When stopping costs more than continuing, consistency becomes the logical choice, not the emotional choice, the logical one. And logic is far more reliable under pressure than emotion. You don't need to feel inspired to act logically. You just need to recognize the cost. Most people design their lives to make quitting easy, flexible deadlines, private goals, no consequences, no witnesses. And then they wonder why consistency feels impossible. It's not a character flaw. It's a design flaw. The environment rewards stopping, so stopping happens. Designing consequences is about reversing that reward structure. It's about making the default outcome support consistency. When showing up avoids loss, the brain begins to favor showing up. Over time, the habit stops feeling forced. It becomes self-preserving. Consequences don't need to be extreme. They need to be immediate and meaningful. Long-term consequences don't work because the brain discounts the future. Immediate discomfort, however small, is far more effective than distant regret. This is why accountability systems succeed where motivation fails. There's a reason people train harder with a coach than alone. There's a reason deadlines matter. There's a reason commitments stick when they're shared. External pressure fills the gap when internal motivation fades. It's not weakness, it's realism. The goal is not to punish failure. The goal is to make quitting inconvenient, to add enough resistance that stopping requires effort. When stopping requires effort, continuing becomes easier by comparison. And behavior follows the path of least resistance. In 2026, design your life so backing out is harder than showing up. Build structures where consistency protects you from loss. Where showing up is the simplest way to maintain stability. Where quitting triggers discomfort instead of relief. When consequences are aligned correctly, consistency no longer feels like self-control. It feels like self-preservation. And when consistency becomes the safest option, it stops being a struggle. Consistency doesn't change your life overnight. That's the part most people struggle to accept. We live in a world trained to expect instant feedback and immediate results. When change doesn't show up quickly, we assume it isn't working. We assume we chose the wrong path, the wrong method, or the wrong goal. But consistency doesn't operate on urgency. It operates on inevitability. Consistency doesn't ask for your patience. It demands your trust. It asks you to act before you see proof, to repeat actions long before they feel meaningful. That's why it's so often abandoned, not because it's ineffective, but because its power is quiet in the beginning. It works in silence while attention looks elsewhere. Small actions repeated daily create momentum, not dramatic actions, not heroic efforts. Small actions that seem almost insignificant in isolation. A single step taken today doesn't look like progress. One focused hour doesn't look like transformation. One decision to show up doesn't look like success. But these actions are not meant to impress. They are meant to accumulate. Momentum is misunderstood. People think momentum comes after big wins. In reality, momentum comes from continuity, from not stopping, from creating a chain of action that doesn't break. Momentum is psychological. It's the feeling that you're in motion, that you're moving forward, even when the destination is still far away. And once momentum exists, stopping feels worse than continuing. Momentum creates confidence. Not confidence in your ability to achieve the final result, but confidence in your ability to keep going. This is a crucial difference. Most people wait to feel confident before they act. But confidence is a side effect, not a prerequisite. It is earned through repetition. Each time you show up, even imperfectly, you prove something to yourself. And proof builds belief. Confidence doesn't come from talent alone. It comes from evidence. And evidence is created through consistent action. When you've shown up 100 times, doubt loses credibility. When you've stayed when quitting would have been easier, fear has less authority. Confidence becomes grounded, not fragile. Confidence then begins to shape identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who hopes to change and start seeing yourself as someone who does what they say they will do. Identity forms quietly, almost without notice. You don't wake up one day and declare it. You realize it later. In hindsight, when certain behaviors no longer feel optional, identity is the turning point. Once identity shifts, consistency becomes self-reinforcing. You're no longer pushing yourself to act, you're protecting who you are. The action isn't about the outcome anymore. It's about alignment, about staying true to the version of yourself that has been built through repetition. And identity creates results people call luck. From the outside, it looks sudden, it looks effortless, it looks like things just worked out. But that perception ignores the invisible accumulation that made the outcome inevitable. Luck is the name people give to results they didn't see being built. The compound effect is powerful precisely because it's underestimated. People dismiss small actions because they don't feel impactful. They don't feel urgent. They don't satisfy the desire for immediate validation. But time multiplies what you repeat. Whatever you do consistently gets amplified. This works in both directions. Consistency doesn't only compound progress, it compounds neglect as well. Misdays compound, avoidance compounds. Small compromises repeated often create outcomes just as inevitable as small positive actions. The system doesn't care about intent, it responds to repetition. This is why the early stages of consistency feel unrewarding. The effort seems larger than the return. The work feels heavier than the progress. But this imbalance doesn't last. At some point the curve bends. Effort begins to feel lighter. Results begin to accelerate. And what once felt slow starts to feel unstoppable. Most people quit right before this shift. They misinterpret silence as failure. They assume nothing is happening. But the compound effect works beneath the surface first. Roots grow before anything appears above ground. Consistency builds infrastructure long before it delivers visible outcomes. When momentum, confidence, and identity align, action becomes natural. You no longer rely on motivation. You don't need reminders. You don't negotiate. The behavior has become part of who you are. And at that point, results are no longer a matter of if, but when. This is why consistency is so powerful. Not because it produces instant transformation, but because it makes outcomes unavoidable. Given enough time, the result is locked in. The only variable left is whether you stay long enough to see it. And when that result finally appears, people will call it luck. But luck had nothing to do with it. The world is moving faster and it's not slowing down for anyone. Information travels instantly. Expectations update constantly. Trends appear and disappear before most people even realize they existed. What once took years to change now shifts in months, sometimes weeks. Speed has become the default environment, and that speed is quietly reshaping how people think, work, and live. At the same time, attention is shrinking, not because people care less, but because everything is competing for their focus. Notifications interrupt thought. Algorithms reward reaction over reflection. Every device, platform, and feed is designed to pull attention outward, fragment it, and monetize it. Focus has become one of the rarest resources of our time. Distraction is everywhere, and it's no longer accidental. It's engineered. The modern world doesn't just allow distraction, it depends on it. And in that environment, inconsistency isn't just common, it's encouraged. Stopping, switching, and restarting feel normal. Depth feels optional. Commitment feels outdated. Inconsistent people will feel overwhelmed, not because they lack ability, but because they're constantly responding instead of progressing. Every new idea pulls them in a different direction. Every interruption resets momentum. They're busy, but not moving, active, but not advancing. The faster the world moves, the more exhausting inconsistency becomes. Consistent people, on the other hand, will feel unstoppable, not because they're immune to distraction, but because they've designed around it. They know what they're building and they return to it daily. Speed doesn't scatter them, it sharpens them. While others react, they repeat. While others chase, they compound. 2026 won't reward intensity. Intensity burns bright and fades fast. It produces strong starts and weak finishes. It creates excitement but not endurance. Intensity feels productive, but it's unstable. It relies on emotional spikes that can't be sustained in a high-noise world. 2026 will reward reliability. Reliability doesn't trend. It doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up again and again. In a world of constant change, reliability becomes rare, and whatever is rare becomes valuable. The person who can be counted on, who returns daily, who stays when others leave, gains a quiet but powerful advantage. The pace of the world amplifies the difference between starting and staying. Anyone can start when energy is high. Anyone can feel motivated by a new beginning. But staying requires something deeper than excitement. It requires structure, identity, and commitment. And those qualities become more valuable as everything else becomes more chaotic. This is why 2026 is a deciding year. Not because something dramatic will happen overnight, but because the gap between consistent and inconsistent behavior will widen. The compounding effect will accelerate. Small advantages will grow faster. Small lapses will cost more. Time will magnify whatever patterns are already in place. People who drift will feel like they're falling behind, even if they're working harder than ever. People who repeat will feel steady, even as the world feels unstable. One group will experience speed as pressure. The other will experience it as leverage. The world doesn't reward how hard you start. Strong beginnings are common. Announcements are easy. Declarations are everywhere. What's rare is follow through. What's rare is endurance. What's rare is staying committed after the excitement fades and the work becomes routine. How long you stay determines what you build. Staying allows learning to deepen, skills to sharpen, judgment to mature, trust to form. Nothing meaningful is built in bursts. It's built in layers over time by people who remain present long enough to understand what they're doing. The shrinking of attention means fewer people will go deep, and that creates opportunity for those who do. While others skim, you can study. While others switch, you can stay. Depth becomes a competitive advantage when most people are distracted. Overwhelm isn't caused by too much to do. It's caused by too much unfinished, by too many open loops, by constant resets. Consistency closes loops. It finishes cycles. It creates psychological relief, and that relief fuels further progress. In a fast world, consistency creates calm. It gives you something stable to return to, a fixed point in constant motion. That stability becomes a source of confidence. You're no longer reacting to every shift. You're anchored. 2026 will quietly separate those who dabble from those who commit, those who test from those who build, those who start from those who stay. The separation won't be loud. It won't make headlines, but it will be unmistakable in results. The question won't be whether the world is moving fast. It will be whether you've built something steady enough to move with it. Consistency isn't about forcing yourself. That idea has exhausted too many people for too long. Forcing implies resistance. It implies friction. It implies a constant internal battle between what you want now and what you say you want later. And battles like that don't create long-term change. They create burnout. They create guilt. They create cycles of starting and stopping that slowly erode confidence. Consistency is about design, about shaping your life in a way where quitting isn't an option you casually consider, where showing up isn't an act of heroism, but the default. When the environment supports the behavior survives. When it doesn't, even the strongest intentions collapse. Most people try to change their behavior without changing their surroundings. They keep the same routines, the same triggers, the same distractions, and then demand different results. They rely on willpower to override design, but willpower is temporary. Design is persistent. Design works even when you're tired, distracted, or discouraged. When quitting is easy, consistency feels impossible. When quitting is difficult, consistency becomes natural. This is the shift most people never make. They focus on pushing harder instead of making stopping harder. They try to summon more motivation instead of removing the exits, remove the daily decision. That's where consistency begins to stabilize. Decision-making drains energy before action even starts. When you decide once and follow through daily, you protect your mental bandwidth. You remove the need to convince yourself repeatedly. The system carries you forward when your emotions fluctuate. Anchor actions to identity. Behavior sticks when it reflects who you believe you are. Identity creates internal pressure that no external reminder can match. When actions defend your self-image, skipping feels uncomfortable. You're no longer chasing outcomes, you're maintaining alignment. And alignment is powerful. It keeps you steady when results are slow and invisible, make failure costly. Not painful, not punishing, but costly enough to matter. Cost introduces pause, it interrupts impulse. When quitting carries discomfort, the brain reevaluates. Suddenly, continuing becomes the easier option, and behavior follows the easiest path available. These three principles work together. Remove choice so you don't debate. Anchor to identity so you don't quit quietly. Add cost so stopping isn't painless. Together, they turn consistency from a test of character into a product of environment. This is where most people misunderstand consistency. They think it's about trying harder. It's not. It's about trying less and designing more, less negotiation, less reliance on emotion, less dependence on motivation, more structure, more clarity, more inevitability. When consistency stops being a struggle, it becomes an advantage. Not because life gets easier, but because progress becomes predictable. You stop guessing whether you'll show up. You stop hoping you'll stay on track. You know you will. And that certainty changes how you think, how you plan, and how you move. An advantage doesn't need to be flashy, it needs to be dependable. In a world where most people start strong and fade quietly, the person who stays becomes powerful by default. Not louder, not faster, just present. Again and again, this kind of consistency builds trust with others, but more importantly, trust with yourself. Each time you show up, you reinforce the belief that your word matters, that belief compounds. It strengthens identity. And a strong identity doesn't need constant reinforcement. It holds under designing your life this way, if this way requires honesty. You have to admit where you quit easily, where you rely on emotion, where your environment undermines your intentions. But that honesty is liberating. It shifts the focus from self-blame to system building. You're not inconsistent because you're flawed. You're inconsistent because your life makes inconsistency convenient. Change the convenience and behavior follows. The question isn't whether you can be consistent in 2026. Most people can for a while. The real question is whether you're willing to design your life so consistency is unavoidable. So showing up is easier than backing out. So staying is simpler than quitting. When you remove escape routes, commitment deepens. When commitment deepens, identity solidifies. And when identity solidifies, results follow quietly, steadily, inevitably. The choice isn't dramatic. It doesn't require a breakthrough moment. It requires design. And once the design is in place, consistency stops asking for permission. It simply happens. Will you design your life so you have no other choice?